My mother was always afraid of cancer. She feared the long and painful death that cancer would mean. She was sure it would get her through her stomach. So for decades, she ate food like it was poison. When she was admitted into hospital, she was diagnosed with the exact inoperable cancer that she had feared. She asked for and received a medically assisted death. And that's what I want to talk to you about. My experience with our right to choose when and how we die. Once my mother got her permission, she was so relieved. Her appetite was reborn. For the 12 days between permission and procedure, she ate and she ate like she was going to die in a delicatessen. She grew strong, rounder. She got out of that hospital bed, took her walker, and went to the hospital ground park. And there she fed the birds, and she reminisced for longer and longer each day my brother and I went to visit her. People whose relatives were terminal on her ward used to come and see her just to see someone getting better. They went home hopeful. And when my mother died, me holding her hand, she was as pink-cheeked and happy with life as I'd ever seen her. Most of the argument about medical assistance in dying, MAID for short, has been about making it available for people in my mother's situation. There's not a lot of information out there to prepare you for what you're going to do by respecting your loved one's wish to die. A loved one may never come to you and ask you to respect their wish to leave their bodies behind. But for everyone in Canada, now, they could. This is how I make sense of it. The Dutch, who've had a lot more experience with this than we have, they call it a staged death. And it is. For the entire time of the process, everything should be the way the person's going to die wants it. On her final day, my mother told my brother and I not to cry. So we didn't. Instead, we read alternate verses from Ode to a Nightingale, the poem that contained her favorite line in poetry, half in love with easeful death. My mother's doctor was a kind woman. She never took her eyes off my mother while she did her work. My mother loved to be looked at that way. And when she had your attention, she'd tell you stories. She started to brag about the achievements of her sons, mine in poetry and my brother's in, and that's where her voice trailed off and she went to sleep. She snored a little and then went quiet. 10 minutes later, the doctor listened to her heart and said, "She's gone." There are hundreds of people, thousands like me, who have helped their loved ones die this way. If I didn't believe that my mother had a right to that choice, I wouldn't have been beside her when she did. But medical assistance in dying is an emotional, awkward subject. So there aren't that many stories about people like us who are left behind. When I think of the documentaries I saw, I see the camera turning away from the person who's going to die to the people beside their bed, both participants and witnesses. They ask, the camera asks them, "How does it feel?" They say they are grateful and happy for their loved one. They also say, "It was surreal," or "I was torn." The camera never lingers on the complexities behind those simple sentences. It is surreal. I was torn. For a long time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had betrayed my mother and myself. I know I'm not alone, but that's not enough. I wanted something to connect my individual experience to something larger than individual experience. I'm a poet. I'm a professor of English. My earliest memory of my mother's voice is her reading to me as a child. I needed the comfort and wisdom of an old story. An old story about something as new as medical assistance in dying, you think that would be impossible to find. And I won't tell you how many things I went through to get one, but I found one in a very surprising place to me. It was in the Bible's account of Peter's denial of Christ. I'm an atheist. There's no story in the Bible to persuade me there is a God. But there are great stories there. If you enter them, they will show you something about yourself that you would never find if you had to stick to what you could prove. At its heart, Peter's story is this. On the eve of his arrest, Jesus tells Peter, the disciple who loves him the most, that he will deny Christ 3 times before the rooster crows. Peter says, I couldn't do that. But then he does. Peter denies Christ 3 times. Peter does what he did not think he could ever do. The normal way that you hear this story is it's about the way Peter gave in to his fear. But I don't think that's the point of the story. I denied everything in me right up to that moment that would have said, stop. And I did it because my mother asked me. So breathe my life into Peter's story. What if Jesus isn't making a prediction, but he's giving an instruction? Peter, you who love me most, you will deny me 3 times. This is what has to happen. This is your sacrifice. Peter weeps when his work is done, just as I wept when I let go of everything I had held back in order to do what my mother had asked. My mother died easeful with her choices and her life as I had ever seen her. Still, if I could talk to her, I would say I'm happy for her. And then I'd ask her, forgive me. When Peter meets the resurrected Christ, he too asks for forgiveness. Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? Peter says yes. Jesus says nothing. There is nothing to forgive. At my mother's bedside, 2 commands collided that I could not reconcile. Do not be part of my mother's death. Respect my mother's request to have me help her die. And in that moment I sat silent. I was true to myself and betrayed myself at exactly the same time. For 3 years, I could not mourn my mother's death without telling myself, I let someone kill her. Peter's story tells me this: there are things in this life you will never be able to reason through. I hadn't seen it before, but I see this now. In the face of my mother's approaching death, I stayed. I did not abandon her. I did the only thing I could do, purely out of love, without thinking of myself. I gave love all that love asked. And in doing that, I found a greater love than I had ever known before.